Good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending. My name's Matt Sump, and I got with me today Devin Glass, and we'll be going over some of the general enhancements to Mastercam 2022. So a little bit about the agenda today. I'm going to be covering basically everything today. I'm going to be keeping the PowerPoint to a minimum. It'll be mostly Mastercam demos where if any of you were on the preview webinar a month or two ago, that was a lot of this general overview and stuff like that. But what I did want to show here is, let me pop out of my PowerPoint here for a second and go to my browser. So if you go to what'snew.mastercam.com, that's where everything that's new in 2022 is listed, and it can get pretty detailed. So there's certain things in here that I won't be covering. I may have touched on them in the preview webinar, but I'm trying to focus today more on things that are more demoable and that you can demonstrate inside of Mastercam versus a single line blurb of something that's improved. For example, when you open a file in 2022, if the CAD model or wireframe is the same color as your background color, before you'd have to take a couple steps to modify the color so that the part would show up, but 2022 will automatically do that. So little things like that I'm not going to be covering today, so I certainly encourage you to kind of browse through here and see if there's anything applicable beyond what I cover in here today. Let me go to my first Mastercam file here. So the first section here, I'm going to be covering some design changes that are new in Mastercam 2022. So I'll minimize my toolpath manager a bit there. And the first one I want to cover is the push-pull function in model prep. So on your model prep tab here, push-pull, before we were limited to a single solid body at a time, but in 2022, I can select multiple bodies at the same time and then adjust them accordingly. So, if you're bringing up fixturing to match up a plate or trying to figure out some other things, you can push pull. And this works on faces or fillets or really any feature that you could push pull before you can do across multiple solid bodies. Just be mindful that if it's a real complex solid and you're doing it across multiple solids, you want to have some uniformity there because it's still utilizing that parasolid kernel in the background, and you want to make sure that it's achievable results of what you're trying to do, so you don't just get the little yellow error box in the top right corner. And that also applies, this multiple body function in model prep now also applies to the add history. I won't exactly demo that, but I did want to mention that you can add history across multiple solid bodies as well. And I'll show some enhancements to that add history as well here in a few minutes. One of the other ones I wanted to highlight was the direct editing of wireframe entities in 2022. So I have some general wireframe here, and I just have a line. So anytime, and I've had some people ask me how they get to that feature. Really all you have to do is double click on the wireframe entity, and then you start getting some control points. So if it's a line, you'll get a midpoint to move it, or you can also switch here. There's a little button that pops up, kind of like the dynamic gnomon does, where I can switch between functions within this function. So instead of moving it, it's now set to copy, so I can do more of a transform command right in there as well. I can modify the length or the angle. It'll still maintain the snap. So see, I have it kind of off at an angle here. I can snap it, and now it knows that it's perpendicular. Even though it's just a line created off of a edge point of that model, it knows that it's now perpendicular to that axis. And then I also want to show how arcs work. So if I double click an arc here, I can modify the length or angle of the arc. If I go there in the positive direction, it will create that part of it. Or if I undo and do it again, I can go around this way and modify the arc that way. And there's also a flip option that pops up, so I can get the inverse. And then there's also absolute or relative commands there too. Next quick one I wanted to highlight here is when you're creating a surface. Prior, when you created a surface, you had to either know based on how the surface coloring worked, or had to go back in and analyze a surface to check the normal on it. Because if you look here in Mastercam, I get kind of a darker green color by default, and then a lighter green on the side that the normal is displayed on. But now in 2022, just some additional visual feedback. As long as I just hover over that surface as I'm creating it, I can both view what the normal is, or if I click on the surface, it will flip that normal, and you can see my color changes there. So I got that surface created. I can say okay, and now it becomes whatever my surface color here is in regular Mastercam. Oh yeah, the attendees are always muted, but feel free to ask questions as we go through here. All right, the next one I want to cover here is a command I've actually found handy a couple times already, like oil grooves on a part or like a gasket groove on a mold, is on your wireframe tab here under the curve section is curve center, which is at the bottom here. So my first example, this is just two parallel swept lines through here. And you could probably use, transform dynamic and just get this center line here, and not really that useful. I mean, it does make it less clicks than the transform method would be. But unfortunately, the part that I had to use this on for a demo recently, I can't show on screen since it was an NDA part. But it was basically similar to this in that it was two different swept chains with slightly different geometry. So if I was to do like transform dynamic here, it wouldn't exactly match the center point of this channel. But using this new function, I can just click here and here, say okay, and you can see that that line, even though it's not exactly the same throughout those two sweeps, and there's like a little part that sticks out here, that curved center will compensate for it and get you that exact center line. So if you're running a size-on-size tool down a channel, it makes a really nice zero comp line to drive off of. Next small one I wanted to cover here on transform. So if I go to transform dynamic, if I pick on, say, this solid body to transform, and I pick, the center of the part, under my copy function here, I now have the option to go in both directions. So, if you're setting up multiple vices on a table or multiple parts in a file, I can now copy them in both directions and get a set value, let's say 8 inches. So those are both 8 inches away from that center point that I determined when I was transforming. And then I get 3 bodies right away instead of having to do that in a couple transform operations like I would have to in the past. And then I can always right click and say clear colors if I want to get rid of the transform colors. But as far as design highlights on this file here, so this is what I was talking a little bit about before. The add history function in 2022 was improved. It'll support multiple bodies, but also what it'll do here is if I select the solid I want to, and if I go to my solids manager here, I believe it's solid number 4. Hang on, let me, yeah. Solid number, the fourth in the tree here is this part. You can see it's just a blank solid, just a body, a dumb solid as people may call it. But if I go to add history here, I have the option, I have a couple new options in here. So I can find hole operations like I could before, and I can include split holes, but I can also create plugs now too. So if you're doing, say, a roughing operation and you don't want to worry about chaining geometry to avoid, or like now, like Devin will cover tomorrow, the OptiRough is included even with the base mill now. So a quick way to basically fit where your roughing tool can go. I can make this radius maximum a little bigger. And I also want to modify the level that I put my plugs on here. It's going to default to level number 1. But if I say OK, now it'll say nine holes were detected in the body, and you can see it creates plugs for all of those features there. If I use the keyboard trick in Mastercam, Alt-E, and I just say select entities to keep on the screen, we can get an idea of what those plug bodies look like. So even though that was a counter bore there, it'll still figure out how to plug it. And I can hit Alt-E again to bring everything back. And I don't have an example on this particular part, but it'll also do, for like 5-axis programming, we'll do interrupted holes. So say this bracket was double the width and there was a gap between the bracket, it would plug the hole all the way through both, extending through the top and the bottom of the solid. So that can be handy too. And yeah, we had a question about, did I use model prep to modify the wireframe? No, you just have to double click wireframe entity. So if I have any wireframe on the screen, once it's created, I just have to double click on it to get into the edit command of the wireframe. So it's real. I was slightly confused on that at first. I was looking for the command in the ribbon bar somewhere under my right click menu, but nope, you just have to double click it to get into modifying wireframe directly. And now we're going to get into some vector enhancements for 2022. So I'm going to move on to my third file here. So I already kind of have this programmed with using the new unified multi-axis, and we're utilizing these vectors to further control the toolpath. Because, you know, if you typically go into a toolpath and you're saying, you know, normal to a surface with a specific degree and so forth, you might not always get exactly what you want. So what they did for 2022 here is under our wireframe. So under our line command here, we have some new commands. We have line normal to a point, normal to a grid, and normal to along a chain. The most handy one I've seen out of these, you know, it's worth probably playing around with these a bit, is line normal to a point. So typically, if I want to create a vector on here, it would be somewhat of a manual process. But now what I can do, so it's under that line closest and then line normal to a point here, is I can click on, say, this surface, and then I can pick an edge where I want that vector to appear. And that's kind of what I did along this bottom section here, is I can click that. It already creates the vector for me. And since the command is technically line normal to a point, this line right now is normal to that surface. So that angle is matching up with the angle of the surface. But I also have the option to modify that. So if I want that line to deviate from where it is, or I can just go ahead and create a few more along here and get them created on the edge of this surface that you know would potentially drive a multi-axis toolpath off of. But what I can also go into here is, say these are already created, I can go under the modify length command here. Before it was always just modify length. There wasn't a drop down, but now below there is modify vector. So this works similar to when I was modifying the vector in the previous command, but I can click on any vector and modify it from that command. And it's, you know, works similar to transform, but it saves you a couple steps, and then I don't have to define where I'm modifying that vector from. It knows that the vector is attached, or how the vector was originally created, you know, attached to the solid, normal to that surface, and then I can modify it from there. The one enhancement request I did give Mastercam some feedback on this was I would like to be able to do multiple of these at a time. You know, if I wanted to set all these vectors additional 30 degrees instead of doing them one by one would be handy. And they said that would be fairly easy to add, but we'll see when they get that in there. But being able to modify these easier just in general is a nice benefit to 2022. And yeah, looks like Devin answered all. And make sure you look in that main chat box of the webinar. So if Devin replies all to a particular question, you will all get to see the question plus the answer listed in there. And one thing to note in here, if I go into the parameters of this toolpath, just as kind of a tip for multi-axis, on your tool axis control page, you have all your different options here. I have this toolpath changed to lines, and all those vectors are selected to determine the angle of the tool throughout the toolpath, where before I was using, I think, surface with tilt, and it wasn't getting me exactly what I wanted. So that will be handy. So you can see that that tool now is following the vectors of those lines versus however the surface determined the toolpath angle. And if I were to modify any of those vectors, I'd just have to recalculate the toolpath and I would get additional tool sweep from there. And I haven't loaded it yet, and this is a little side note before I move on to the next file. Update 1 of Mastercam 2022 came out yesterday. I did not load it yet just because I have everything all set up for the webinar and didn't want it to mess with anything. But I did notice, as I was playing with this unified multi-axis, setting up this file that Devin will cover tomorrow, sometimes I would go to that tool tilt page or the tool axis control page, and I wouldn't modify anything, but it would still mark the toolpath dirty. That was one of the changes that I noticed in there. But if you download the 2022 update 1, there will be let me exit out of my PowerPoint here, minimize my browser. There's a README file here. And if you click on update 1, and this is in the documents folder in Mastercam. So if I go to all apps and then go down to Mastercam 2022 and then README, this will be the README because I haven't installed update 1 yet. It will be the README from the original 2022 release, but that README link will update once you install update 1, and then you could read through all the changes. So Mastercam should automatically pop up. I actually closed out of it, but when you go to fire up Mastercam today, you might have already noticed the notification saying that there's an update available. One tip there is that app is actually separate from the main Mastercam executable. So if you close out a Mastercam first and then run through the updater, you won't have to reboot your computer. So you can save yourself a little bit of time. But make sure Mastercam has time to fully close out and that the Mastercam event log is also closed out. Then as long as both of those are closed out, like I said, you can update to update 1 and be on your way. So we're going to cover a little bit of the plane enhancements and some other changes here in 2022. So I just have a somewhat complex of a part, but this is more just to show off some planes things in here. And also some other things I want to briefly mention. So the first one here is, you may have noticed if I'm in the parameters of a toolpath in 2022, I have this generate toolpath tick box next to my green check mark on basically every mill toolpath. Basically what that does is as I hit the green check mark, it's if the toolpath needs to be regenerated, it's going to automatically start doing that process. So I don't have to go up here and say, regenerate selected operations or regenerate any dirty operations, just saving yourselves a couple clicks. But one thing to be mindful of, if you're kind of beginning to set up a 3D toolpath and you don't want it to quite generate yet, you can always untick that toolbox, untick that checkbox, and make some more adjustments before you actually go ahead and regenerate it. 2D toolpaths, you really don't have to worry about that for any sort of regeneration time, but it's a handy feature that I've already been using a lot since 2022 came out. And one note about that too is, speaking of regeneration time, you can see here I have the time it took my computer to regenerate this toolpath at 41 seconds. if you right click anywhere in the operations manager here, you have what's called display options. And under the display options, the new feature for 2022 is this toolpath generation time. A lot of people don't know about this window in general, but for example, if I'm working on a part that's strictly a top, VMC part, I can clean up my display options here and I can turn off, say, the tool plane and comp and construction plane and clean up my how this looks a little bit. But just to review where I was at for that, so right click display options, I'll turn those back on. I can turn on the toolpath generation time. Now, the only thing to note here is it's going to try to be as accurate as possible, but depending on the specific toolpath, how that toolpath is generated, like stock models, for example, or any of the toolpaths that are utilizing the graphics card a little bit in the background, it might vary from the exact real world time it took to generate. Another place you can always look here is in the Mastercam event log. It will tell you when it calculates a toolpath how long that took to take in milliseconds. And then either, you can know what the conversion is or plug the number into Google and it'll give you an idea of how long that particular function took. But you can see Mastercam's outputting an execution time for every function that I do inside of Mastercam. So another thing here too, when I'm inside a toolpath, before you had to have one of those space mice or a extra peripheral mouse for like a space ball to rotate the part while you had a toolpath dialog open. But as you can see here, I can do any movement to the model while I'm inside the toolpath window. But additionally, my analyze functions are also active. So one of the few ways I customize my right-click menu anytime I get a new version of Mastercam is I add the analyze dynamic function to my right-click menu. And you can see, even though I'm inside the toolpath, I can select on this surface, for example, and get my analyze information while I'm still in the toolpath. So, if you're trying to figure out, step overs or different parameters in a given toolpath and utilizing some data from the model, an old workaround would be I have to find some box with a yellow field and, pull some geometry information off of here as kind of a trick workaround to get a similar result. But, now I have all my, I can analyze distance, I can analyze entity properties, I can do any of that while inside of a toolpath. So the next thing I want to talk about here is a little bit on the planes manager. So I already had these set up because I want you guys to see what this looks like. So you can see I have a little chain link icon. It might be, depending on the quality of the webinar recording or how that's being broadcast over the internet, it might be a little hard to see. But there's a chain link icon with a down dotted line over. So that's the parent, and anyone with the blue box going down to the gray chain is a child plane. So if I were to edit this plane, you can see that it is linked here. There's a new option under set as. It's linked to the setup one plane. And if I modify the setup one plane, it's not linked to anything. So it's, any plane that's not linked to another one is a parent plane. And then any plane that's linked to another one is considered a child. So what I can do here is, since this setup one has the setup one backside and setup one front side as children of it, if I modify setup one, and let's say I'm moving it from this locator ball and say, we changed the offset of the machine or the origin of the part, and I want to move it down to this circle down here. If I say okay, now my setup one back and my setup one front have also moved to that location and are all connected to each other like they were before, but just in a different spot. And, you know, as you guys are probably thinking about use cases for this, you know, especially if I'm working on, say, a horizontal machine, I can set up my initial, you know, quote unquote, 3-plane work setup for my first part on a horizontal machine. If I copy that parent plane and say I make a setup 2, the setup 2 would also make a setup 2 back and a setup 2 front type workflow. So to explain that a little further, I can, once I get that sort of main parent-child setup, I can create like cousin planes of that initial setup to work around a given part. So you can save yourself a lot of time basically setting up planes with this function of being able to link them together. And one thing I wanted to highlight here while I'm in modifying a specific plane, let's go back to edit this one. You weren't able to do this before. If I click on a given letter of the dynamic gnomon in 2022, you can see that little arrow pops up. It will make my view immediately planar to that letter. So I went from Y to X. Now if I click on Z, it'll flip my entire G view around based on the angle of that given plane. So, you know, if I modify this to some funky angle and then click on the Y, you know, now I get that off angle view of the part based off the letter. So kind of a small change, but just another way to move your view around, especially if you start working with more complex planes on parts. And then one other thing I want to talk about while I was in this file is, let's say on my levels here, I have this vise. So this vise is technically holding a stock that I have set up in this part. Say we needed to flip this around or move the vise to the other side of the part. Just a simple function here. If I right click, I can say copy the entities right at the level manager level. I can say copy entities, and I can right click a different plane. So see, I have a second plane already ready to go called Vice 2, and there's no entities on it right now. I can right click and say paste entities, and you can see now I have 5 and 5, you know, like any copy paste, and it's an exact copy of what I moved over. But now since it's split onto a different level, I can say select all entities, because they're right on top of each other. So, you know, it would be hard to window select or click select. And now I can say transform dynamic, and I could start moving this vise around to whatever, you know, maybe I had to move it up for this other operation here. And I'm set to copy in both directions still, because I was doing that before. Just to, you know, now it's split out to a separate level. I can move it around and, you know, use any of my coincident parallel type transform commands that we've added in recent versions. But probably not the best example for this, but I just want to show the functionality of being able to cut, copy, paste entities directly in the level manager. And as someone who uses levels a lot to keep my file organized, it's saved me a lot of time already on being able to move parts around a given file. All right, the next one I'm going to bring up is similar file, but before I had it all set up. So I can bring it in. It's going to be just the actual machining part that we have. And, you know, say this is a part, maybe I've done a similar one in the past where I have some of the work holding set up, but not all of it. Before, if I wanted to bring in all the work holding, I would have to merge in each file individually. But now if I go to File Merge here, you can see I'm not seeing all my files there. Just make sure instead of defaulting to just Mastercam files, change it to all files here. Now I see all my stuff. So I want to bring in my custom fixture. And then you can use some Windows commands to select multiple files here. I can either hold Shift and click the bottom one, or I could have held Control and clicked each one individually. But I can click open here. And I have it all kind of brought in. Most of it came in correctly. I did this on purpose just for example's sake. But as you can see here, my locating ball, my fixture, and my production stock are all in the right spot, but that vise is not. Now, I could go in here and try to dynamically transform it, but you can see everything's kind of one group, which isn't what I want. So what you can do, and a handy part of what this new multiple file merge does automatically in the background, and a feature that I don't see a lot of people use in Mastercam in general, is once I can just bring everything in, say, okay, everything's in there. You know, the levels aren't exactly fully cleaned up and things like that. You know, this 5-axis vise I have here, I think it's a Lang vise, is split up amongst a couple different levels here. But what that multiple file merge does is I have my groups manager in my quick selection masks over here. It automatically splits those merged files into their own groups. So I have my production stock, my tooling ball, my fixture, and then I have the Lang vise. So I can select it. Now I have that part selected, and now I can do a couple things. I can say move all of those entities onto a level. So see, I have a level already set for vise here with nothing on it. So I can move everything to level 100, say okay. Now you can see all these separate levels of the vise are all 0. So I can use the function of right-clicking here and say clear empty levels all. So now it cleans up all those levels that the vise was on, and now I have that vise on that own level. All the components of the vise are together, and now I can, you know, go ahead and transform this any way I want to, you know, get it positioned on the part the way I need it to be. And I won't run through that for sake of time here because we're already at about 10:10, and I said this webinar would be about an hour. So then you can position it from there. But the things to note there is I can merge multiple files at once, and then you want to make sure you use your groups manager over here, which is the 5th one from the bottom, and it'll split any of the merged files into their own group, regardless of how messed up the levels of those imported files are.
Hey, Matt, there's just one more thing. If you could show that again, go ahead and select that vise again using the group manager.
Sure.
Yep. And just hit the green check there. So you don't have to right mouse click on the G view anymore to go change the level. If you right click on, say, level 500 right now, you can say move or copy selected entities towards the, you got it.
Oh, I see.
And now you don't need to go in the right mouse click, change the level. You could just right click on the level you want to move it or copy it to and immediately just throw it on there. So that was the new addition to 2022 as well.
Oh, cool. See, you learn something new every day. I thought I read through that whole sheet, but thanks for the additional tip. Because yeah, that would have saved me probably 4 or 5 more clicks in that whole workflow there. So yeah, what Devin said is to review that. You can right click and you can move selected entities to the highlighted level. So they're on the imported level now. I could say select all those, right click the vise and move them back. And then I'm back to 0 on the imported models level. That's a handy one, Devin. I'm definitely going to use that one too.
Oh, I use it all the time.
Okay, so that's about all I had for sort of general design planes highlights. I don't see any questions, but if there are any, feel free to ask. Next, we're going to move on to some simulator enhancements. So this is a 5-axis demo part that I used actually a while ago when we first started to incorporate those different tool shapes, like the Imugi tools, and now a lot of other tool brands have similar tools where it's a, this is a barrel form tool, where if you're unfamiliar with any of those specific tool shapes, we have some webinars on our channel, or search on YouTube for circle segment tools, and you'll see some of the benefits you can get in multi-axis or even 3-axis, depending on the part, to really reduce the amount of step overs you need to take compared to a regular ball nose end mill to get similar surface finish. But I just have the one tool path here selected. Let me make sure I have my simulation settings right. So I got my finished stock model, I got my Raptor vise, and I'm simulating on a UMC 1000. So I can pop open the simulator. If I click simulate, it'll pop open this file and verify here. I can switch over to the simulation here. And this was an enhancement we did a couple versions ago, but the simulation now is built right into the Mastercam, verify, as we all used to call it, or simulator. So I have backplot verify and machine simulation in one environment. You can also use an external post. This was an option added for 2022. So if you have a post from like Postability where the post is actually linked to the machine simulation, you have the option here now to tie it into the post. Mine isn't lit up because I'm using a different post technically to what the simulation is, but you can now use an external post when using these. So a couple things I want to note here is first, on your reports tab, before you only really had collision reporting here, but now you have proximity alerts, and then you also have axis over travel alerts. So depending on how the machine definition is set up, and like I know offhand because we work with UMCs a lot, the tilt axis is limited to 270.5 degrees. So if you have a tool path that exceeds that limit, before now you would really not see that error until you tried to run the code on the machine, where now that error you'll be able to catch in the simulator saying you got an axis over travel. Or you could use on the view here, use the motion controller and kind of fool with how the motion of the machine is working and seeing where that axis limit is on a given tool path. Like you can position to a certain point in the tool path, bring up that motion controller and say, okay, what if I tilt from 250 to 280 here? Am I going to exceed, the limit of the machine in order to achieve a certain tool path, and then make adjustments from there. But one of the bigger features that they added to this is a measure command. So you can see I have this dimension field over here, and I've tried using Smart Measure. It's okay. The most handy out of all these is the distance measurement, and then you want to make sure that it's feature aligned. If it's direct, it's always going to be that exact same measurement every time. But if I use feature aligned, I don't have to be as precise on where I'm selecting. So I can select, because one of the things I want to highlight here, I'm using the automatic. You can't see the air quotes I'm doing right now, but it's automatic in the placement of the part and the fixture inside the simulator. But you can see this isn't going to happen in the real world. I don't know anyone that makes a levitating vise yet. But if I do distance here and have it feature aligned, if I measure the distance, I can select, say, on the edge of this part and the top of the table here. And then you can see I got, I have this kind of set up so they're nice round numbers. But the work holding is 2 inches above the table. So I need to modify in Mastercam what my simulation settings are so that it simulates more accurately to what I'm trying to get. So I can go back into the simulator options here. Mastercam's going to output where automatic placed the work holding and all the parts that I have selected to simulate. So instead of automatic, I can switch this to more manual translation in XYZ. And this is an easy one because it's just 2 inches. But if it was a more complex number, I could just do minus and then whatever value I pulled from that measure tool to get the part in the right location. So I'm moving everything down 2 inches. I can say okay, and then reprocess the simulation here. And then once this loads up, I'll show you the other handy way that this measure tool can be beneficial, especially when doing any sort of machining where you're concerned about proximity distances. So now I can see, you know, that work holding is nice and flush with my table of the machine. Now, as you can see, based on this file setup, I'm pretty deep with the spindle relative to the table to machine this blade here. So what I can do even before I start running the simulation is I can go to my distance. It's going to remember feature align because it's a modal function, and I just reloaded the simulator. So I can just click on distance, and I can click, say, somewhere along the top edge of the spindle here, and then down on, say, the top edge of the table there. So even though I have proximity alerts and stuff turned on, or my regular collision checking, as I run through this verify, I can slow it down too. And Devin, you might be able to help answer this. I was trying to figure this out, but I get proximity alerts with my tool. Is it because of the tool to the workpiece? Since it's a finished tool path, so the tool is technically within, I think, the default 30 thou that the proximity alert is set to.
Yeah, so what you'd have to do is go into your file options and then tell it to check the machine, the machine housing and or the machine components to the fixture and to itself there. So if you go to the file up there.
Hang on, let me pause this. But as you can see here, before I get into that, it's giving me a live readout as it's going through the simulation on how close I'm getting to there. I probably should have left it before. I had just the generic Mastercam holder that was a lot shorter, and it was getting very close to the table. But Devin's going to show me a little bit on the proximity here that I forgot to ask you. So yeah, so I got the proximity alert distance there.
And you want to make sure that at the bottom there where it says machine, you want to make sure that it's checking against your machine. So you're checking the machine versus the machine.
Okay.
So if any machine component gets too close to a machine component, it'll raise a red flag.
Okay. And then if I uncheck the workpiece, it won't give me that orange output on the tool?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay, yeah, so that went away. And now, yeah, if I had any proximity alerts within, you know, you might want to increase it. If you're worried about the spindle hitting the table, you probably want to make your proximity alert larger than 30 thousandths, just to be safe. But it's a handy way to use this. And, you know, I've talked a lot about 5-axis. A lot of you guys might not have multi-axis machines. How can this be beneficial in, say, a regular Mastercam file? So let me pull up one that I had up prior, but with some toolpaths on it. So simulator TP. So I just have, you know, regular, this is really just a 2D part. I'm doing a bunch of 2D dynamic mill toolpaths to that bracket file we had up earlier in the webinar. Let me make sure this stuff is set up. So I got my initial stock and my vise. So any work holding I have set up, you know, you can save these to a library and use the file merge command or have like a template file. And simulation, I just have my, you know, even though it's not my exact machine, if you're just simulating 3-axis, you can just use the generic 3-axis simulation that's built into Mastercam. There's a handful of default machines. Any of these that say Gen in them are default, and some other ones that are default. You can see I have some custom ones that either were customer purchase posts or ones I've just gotten that were upgrades for 5-axis posts. But if I go into the simulator here, let it load up all those toolpaths. Now I could do a similar thing, but even in just a 2-axis part. And now, you know, this part isn't getting overly close. These toolpaths aren't getting close to the vise, but this is more just showing you how this feature works and how you could use it in your own workflow. But I can go again to the verify tab here. It remembers feature align because I've been on that for this Mastercam session. But I can say distance here and say I want to check the edge of the tool to the corner of the vise here. Now it'll give me a live readout, and I can turn on those proximity alerts as well, but I can also get an idea, you know, if I had vices or clamps or additional vices or clamps in here, I could measure check to those And Devin, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can have multiple measurements running at the same time, or is it just one?
You can have multiple, yeah.
Okay. So I could have the edge of the tool there to that side of the vise, and I could say distance. Maybe I want to do the other edge of the tool. Then you can see I can get a live readout of what those proximity distances are. These values look huge. This is a metric file. I just have that warning suppressed so it doesn't tell me I'm switching between inch and metric as I hop around these various files. But as you can see, there's a couple different tools to play with in here on how you can have those live measure tools assigned in the part. But even like that part before, I was, trying to figure out how far the work holding was off in the automatic mode can save me a lot of time. Or I can remember instances where I was, basically trying to figure out how far to move down or move over a particular work holding in order to get it to line up right.
And I might just add, I had a student in here while we were taking a lathe class where he asked, can we measure the distance between the part and the stock or in the jaws for a lathe? And well, you can't measure that very easily in Mastercam. In the Verify, since those chuck jaws take actual shape, you can measure it within here in the Verify.
Oh, right. That's a good use case. So that's all I had on the simulator. Does anybody have any questions on that part? We're at about 10:26 here, so plus the housekeeping time, we'll be pretty close to being on time here. So the next one I want to bring up is there's a whole new tab in Mastercam 2022 that you may have noticed, and it's called the Mesh tab. As more people get into either using 3D printing like the Mark printers for work holding and stuff like that, is we have a lot more tools to work with STL models or any sort of mesh, OBJ type models that you could bring into Mastercam, or you get scan data and bring it into Mastercam and so forth. So a couple of ones I wanted to highlight as far as functions in here. And a good way to start playing with these too is if you go to one of the independent CAD download websites like 3D Content Central, or like this one, I think it's from Slant 3D. There's a couple different ones where you can download really any sort of mesh model you want and start messing around with it. But one of the first things you want to do is there's a function in here called check mesh. And I can select the mesh. Now I have this one set up where everything's all good. But if there are any errors, it'll create points where those errors are. And then you can use some of the tools that I'll highlight here in a second to either repair the mesh, modify the mesh, get it watertight, as they say, similar to how you would want to make sure a solid's watertight versus a sheet body for better tool pathing performance. So this model's all good using the check tool. And the first one I want to highlight here is modify mesh faces, which is probably the other most common tool that people are going to use. So I could really do anything on here. I'm going to use the L of slant there to highlight how this works. So if I go to modify mesh faces, it's first saying select facets to modify. Now, one thing I noticed in here when I was trying to mess with this, you need to click the little select facets arrow, even though it says select faces to modify. Make sure you click that little select arrow, and then I start getting into what I'm going to be doing. But before I do that, you also want to decide on what function you're going to be using in the mesh tool here. Do I want to create mesh? Do I want to remove facets and create mesh, or just repair? Well, for this example, I'm going to just do remove facets, and I'll show you how we can modify this even after we do the initial selection. But I can go to select here, and you can see here, instead of being a click type tool, it's what they call a brush, and I can modify the radius of the brush. So what I want to go in here is I'm just holding down my left click, and I can basically brush where I want to select. Because, depending on the STL model, there could be a lot of faces. So you don't want to click through 1,000 times. I can, basically paint what I want to select. So I have everything selected there. If I accidentally make a mistake and see I picked up all those faces, If I right click and use the brush, that removes everything. So left click paints, right click removes. So I have all those faces selected that I want to mess with on the letter L here. I can say okay. And now I can get back to what I was talking about there a few minutes ago on what these different functions do. So this is just removing the facets. I could remove the facets and create a mesh. Well, that's basically going to get me back to my original result. I can also do repair, which, see, it nicely fills it in and there's no cracks there. Or I could say create mesh, and then that'll basically give me the inverse of what I selected. But for this example here, I'm just going to say remove faces because I want to highlight another function here in a second. And you also have a box here that might be turned off called automatically preview results. So if I have that turned off, it's not going to preview what I've been doing. So I say just make sure to have that turned on so you can get some live feedback on what you're trying to do. So I can say okay. Now you can see here I have that gap. You can kind of see through there. I'm seeing the back side of the model there. And before I get into repairing that, let me see, I got a couple questions come in. Is there a way to bring in and convert an STL into a solid so it can be used as a stock model? Devin, you might be able to answer that better, but I know we can create meshes from solids.
We cannot create a solid from a mesh. I was just typing up the answer there.
Okay.
We cannot create a solid from a mesh, but to answer your question, STL really is just a mesh. So a stock model is just a mesh. So you should be able to use a STL as a reference for your stock model, and it would be almost exactly the same as if you used create a stock model from scratch, because a stock model is a P mesh just in a toolpath form.
I could probably do that here. I can go to machine. Let's just pick a default mill. I can go stock model, and I can say model, and I can just select that mesh as my stock, and it'll generate.
And when you grab a solid model with stock model, it's essentially converted into a P mesh, similar to how the mesh tool to convert solids into P mesh or to meshes is doing.
Right.
And that's how we were able to get meshes in the past, was to convert it into a stock model and then convert that stock model into a mesh using the toolpath tab, and underneath the stock model there's convert to mesh, which was how we did it in the past.
Yeah, I'm not sure about his question here, if it would be an actual shell here since it's like hollow, or if it would be fully solid. I'm not sure about that part.
Meshes kind of play with their own rules where they could be completely separate pieces in our minds, but in the mesh world, those could be the same mesh, even though there's nothing connecting the two pieces.
Right.
So we don't follow the same rules as with solids. My understanding with this is that it should, if it is mostly encapsulated, it should become part of the stock. But of course, we'd want to make sure that if there's any gaps in our thinking with solids, if there's any gaps, we want to try to fill those up. But meshes in general are a lot less strict on what considers a mesh as what we deal with solids.
And Matt, so you might want to shoot tech over ones that you've been having issues with, that where it's more of like, like a sheet stock or a shell stock, like you said there, versus a solid. And we could see if, maybe there's something we can use in the mesh tools to solidify it up, or there's some other way we can achieve the result you're looking for there. Appreciate the question, though. So let me turn that stock model off and get back to my mesh here. A couple things I wanted to further highlight on the mesh tools here is, we never repaired this gap. So if I have any gaps in the model, or a hole as they call it, is I can say fill holes here under the modify tab of meshes. Now it says select the mesh to fill holes. And now, this one's simple because I basically deleted that entire section. but it'll outline in red any holes that are on the particular mesh. I can select the wireframe, say okay, and then I want to make sure I have my automatically preview results there. And that gets me similar to the repair option that I used when I deleted all that stuff a little bit ago. But it's just an easier way to, as you're cleaning up a model, and, a lot of the times to fix a mesh, you need to basically create a hole and fill it in. Is just an easy way to do that. And since I created that stock model, it's warning at me. So we'll just skip finalizing that feature. One other one I want to highlight here is you can also now trim. Now, trim to surface or a sheet works the same way as trim to plane. So I'll just use trim to plane here since I don't have a surface created, but it would work the same way. If I wanted to create a surface at a specific angle versus using a plane, and I didn't want to necessarily slice the entire model, I could use surface. But for example's sake, trim to plane is going to have the same workflow and functionality as trim to surface sheet does. So I could say trim to plane here. I need to select my target mesh. And then how do I want to trim this? Now you can see here, this kind of tripped me up the first time I did it. I need to select a line to define the plane or press enter to change the method. Now I don't have any wireframe on here, so I don't have a line to select. So I can just hit enter. And instead of using line, I can switch to say, let's say a named plane. And since this part is a little down in Z, I can just use my top plane and say slice. Now, what I can do here is I can do what's called create a cap. And it's leaving it on there because I did the stock model. So hang on, let me just open up this, getting sidetracked with that question. It isn't going to work exactly the way that I wanted it to. So again, it's under trim to plane, pick my target mesh, enter to change the method, and I could say named plane here, say top plane, and you can see it slices it down there. And then one thing you want to be mindful of is you can see it's basically an open body right now, which that definitely wouldn't work for, say, creating a stock model off of this. So you want to make sure you click the create a cap, because I tried this doing it after the fact, and since this is a fairly complex shape, trying to fill in this cap after the fact is a lot harder than just doing it here right as I'm splitting the particular mesh model. If I didn't want to create a cap and I just wanted to split the mesh, because there's another function in here called explode, where you can explode the mesh into a bunch of different meshes that can make, say, tool pathing off of a mesh a little easier. That would be a little bit longer of a demo, so I kind of skipped it for time's sake for today. But this works similar to that, in that if I wanted to split this up a few different ways, I could, instead of capping it off, I could split these and then, say, create two different stock models off of that split. So now instead of having a single mesh, if I go to my statistics here, you can see now I have two meshes there. So again, that's under the mesh, and then either trim to plane or trim to surface or a sheet, which it has sheet there because you can technically trim to a sheet body solid as well as a surface. So that was all I had on the mesh tools, and I know we're at 10:38 here, so I have a couple other things I wanted to cover. I don't have them really highlighted or anything, and unfortunately there wasn't just a whole lot added to lathe and wire. There's been, there's a lot of work going on in the background of lathe, which I can't really talk about yet. I've seen some preview builds and stuff, but basically just, what we did with the mill toolpaths a handful of versions ago now, updating toolpath interfaces and workflows and stuff for more optimized programming. They're working on that for lathe, but it's not here yet. But what they did add for lathe is I use turn profile still almost 100% of the time when I'm programming lathe parts, but you now have, partial chains and start and end points that Devin might cover in the mill toolpaths tomorrow. But like before, you needed wireframe in order to do like a dynamic start and end point in previous versions of Mastercam, but this applies to mill and lathe, and I can have a dynamic start point in just lathe solid chaining versus using, the turn profile or wireframe geometry. And the one thing I wanted to mention on wire is the tech power libraries are finally modal. So if you're using the same power settings, each subsequent toolpath, instead of having to go through the rigmarole of selecting all your tech settings again for each subsequent toolpath, it'll just remember your power settings from the previous one. And, you can modify it from there. But if you're, making similar cuts across a part, you don't have to keep selecting different power settings each time. And so a couple things I wanted to cover that are more, I guess, internet based is there was a big change to the home learning edition for 2022. So before, you could go to our website and go to Mastercam demo here and download, via a password to get it. But 2022 now requires a license. So I have two buttons under the demo page. If you want to practice with Mastercam at home, this is the new workflow on how to get it. So the first thing is you need a My Mastercam account. So if you already have one through work or wherever, or you've created one in the past, you can skip this step, and I'll show you how to get there in a second. But if I click on sign up for a My Mastercam account, it'll take me to this page where you basically enter in your email address, say hello@webinar.com, get started, and then you basically fill out a short form here, and then you get your Mastercam account created. So now you have a My Mastercam account. You have access then to the free Mastercam University courses that are still going on. There's a Mill Essentials, Mill 3D, lathe, and then also a Mastercam Essentials class that's very basic for someone who's never seen Mastercam before on the Mastercam University. But once you have that account created, you can go into here, which I have the link is users.mastercam.com demo landing. But if I go to learning, I believe here, hang on, let me log in again real quick. I can go to under downloads here of my Mastercam account. It's under demo HLE. It makes me log in again for some reason. And it's basically one HLE per My Mastercam account. So if you have a bunch of people that need access to the demo, they'll just have to sign up for an account. Everyone's got an email address these days somewhere, so they can sign up for an account. And then you just say, get a license here. And then you fill out a form. And then basically it generates a license. And it's the same install as the industrial Mastercam. So out this form, you'll get an activation code and a license number. You can plug that in, and you have access then to the HLE. Part of the reason that they did this was that the HLE before didn't have access to some other modules in Mastercam. For example, the port and blade expert you couldn't do with the demo before. Productivity Plus didn't work, and anything related to mill turn didn't work either. So by default, Mastercam installs a handful of quote unquote generic mill turn machines, so you can start practicing, different mill turn functionality without needing a full industrial version of Mastercam. So while I will personally agree that it's a bit of a pain to get it set up before you just download and start running the HLE before, having that extra access to additional functionality is nice. And then the last thing I wanted to cover here is we had kind of a beta of this in 2022, and some customers did get access, but now it's just publicly available, is you are able to borrow a Mastercam license. So if you can just Google Mastercam drivers and utilities here. And you can see under software licensing, there's a software licensing borrow utility. Now, this is applicable to anyone with a network software version of Mastercam licensing. If you're still on a USB style network hasp, or an NHASP as we call it, you can upgrade to a network software license at no charge. You just need to reach out to our customer service or tech support or really anybody. We can get the process started for you. But the software licensing works a lot better on virtual servers. It's easier to manage. It has a nice web portal here, so you can see what active licenses you have. I don't have a network license running, so this is going to error out, but it'll give me a, before with the USB network hasps, it would take a while for that license monitor to pop up. You can get much more real-time license monitoring. It has ability to have wide area network. So instead of only having the option of VPN, if your company's IT has like a wide area network set up, you can access the license that way. It still will work through VPN like we could with the USB net hasps. But if I don't want to fool with a VPN, or maybe I'm going somewhere where I'm not going to have internet access, but I want to have access to Mastercam remotely, this is where I can use this borrowing utility. So once you download the borrow utility, it comes in this folder here. There's a help file, which I'll show in a second. But you basically run this borrow utility, and it won't work while Mastercam's running. Mine doesn't work anyways because I just have a single seat license. I don't have a network license. So I'll just bring up the help file, and you'll see what the interface looks like anyway.
And just to clarify, this is actually installed with 2022 now.
Okay, so I don't need to install it separately?
Only if you have an older version, 2021 through 2019, because this only works, software licensing only goes as far back as 2019.
Right. So this is the little screenshot of what that utility looks like here. I'll just reset. It's not really zoomed in. But it's a real simple interface. You'll get a list of all the licenses that are on your network license, the total number of those licenses, how many are currently borrowed, how many are available, and how many are in use. And if any are in use, it'll give the computer name, or if you're on like a Windows domain server, it'll give the username of the person currently accessing that given module in Mastercam. But let's say, like I had an example come up from a newer customer of mine who wanted to work at night, and he also doesn't want to worry about having to return these licenses when he gets back to work. So you can borrow, when you go to borrow here, and this help file is real nice because it's real straightforward, walking you through on exactly what you need to do to borrow a license. It's just a handful of steps. But your borrow period is in days with a maximum of 10 days, but it'll also accept decimals. So 0.5 would be 12 hours. I'm not sure how many decimals it goes out to because I haven't been able to test it, but like 0.3 would be close to 8 hours. 0.33 would be 8 hours. I'm not sure. I need to get our network license here at the office switched to a software so I can do some more testing. But say you want to do 0.3, you just needed to use it that evening. I would click borrow a license, and similar to what we did for the demo license for the home learning edition, it'll generate both a W number and a license key file or a key code to activate Mastercam somewhere else. So it's borrowing, it's taking that license off of the network server and making its own standalone individual license for that predetermined amount of time. So if I do that, 0.3 for close to 8 hours of borrowing, when I get back to the shop the next day, it's automatically going to have that license returned to the server already because I set that amount of time. If I set the time much longer, just when I get back to the shop, I would open up this borrow utility back, and instead of on the borrow tab, I would go to the return tab and just select return and return that license back to the network. But it's just a nice handy way, if I need to borrow licenses either for a set amount of time or, work off site, I can basically, grab them and use them as needed. I hope that makes sense. If anyone is on a network Weeboo and you have some questions on borrowing licenses and things like that, feel free to reach out to our support. But I have had a couple customers take advantage of that already.
And Matt, if I can just add one thing about the HLE, which you may have in your PowerPoint, but The HLE, just because we had a few questions about it, can only output an education Mastercam file, which cannot be opened in the industrial version of Mastercam. So unfortunately, you can't work from home with a free version of the software and then open it up on a purchase version of the software. But as an addition with 2022, with a bunch of other stuff like the Migration Wizard, Port Expert, etc., we now can actually export using the HLE a STL file and a 3MF file. So if you guys know anybody who has 3D printers or who wants to create, really 3D printers the biggest one, but you can get access to all Mastercam's CAD tools for free, and you'll be able to export an STL or a 3MF file, which a 3MF is another version of STL with a few more locations for data.
Good to know. And yeah, I saw Andrew asked, if you want to switch to network software licensing, yeah, just reach out to someone here at ShopWare, email sales or tech, and we can get you routed. Depending on how your account's set up, basically what we would do is we would process it through Mastercam Corporate. You would get a new network software licensing license key and code. If you're on an existing NetHasp and say you have custom post processors and stuff, those are technically tied to your NetHasp number. So say your NetHasp number was 5907 or something like that. As long as the software licensing number doesn't already exist for your number, which chances are it doesn't because they started the software licensing numbers moving forward. So, we're in like 300,000 and something of they're just sequential from the first seed of Mastercam ever sold. So say you've been a Mastercam customer forever and you just have a 4-digit NetHasp, or even, really old, have a 3-digit NetHasp, your network software license would have the same number as your old network SIM. So all your post processors, we wouldn't have to re-bin them or anything like that. But there is a bit of a process to it. And then once that new software license is up and running and you verify everything's working exactly the way you want, you basically got to ship that USB network dongle back to Mastercam, and that completes the swap. But so there's no downtime. We make sure you're set up with the software license first, get that all set up, everybody working on it. And then once everything's all good, then you send that physical hardware back. So like I said, just reach out and we can get you set up with it. But that was about all I had. I always like to plug the Mastercam forum for more resources. There's a bunch of videos on there. A lot of the topics I covered today, pinned at the top of the Mastercam customer forum, is sort of deeper dives from some of the what they call product owners at Mastercam going through, design, interface, general changes. There's a lot of good videos there on the mill stuff, which Devin will be covering tomorrow, and just additional resources. And then again, that What's New site that I highlighted back at the beginning of the webinar here. Just go to what'snew.mastercam.com and you can, browse around in here on different things. And I don't want to spoiler alert for Devin's webinar tomorrow, but all the milling enhancements and stuff are in there too. And again, thanks for your time, and hopefully we'll see a lot of you tomorrow. Have a good rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, guys.